All right. So before we dive into things too much here, and I'll talk about this a little bit at the end of class. What should be popping up after class today? Module 2 quiz, which is due by the end of day Monday, and also the module 3 reading due by the end of the day Monday, right? So they've got them kind of already sitting there. You'll see these pop up after class. We'll also talk at the end about that first halfback assignment. So kind of wanted to get an early start on that. It'll be related to kind of things we talk about this week, maybe a little bit early in the next week. I'll go over this more at the very end of class a little bit, but you'll see that pop up after class as well. Okay, so that's where we're at. What kind of housekeeping stuff? Other than that, I'll mention it now so I can save some time at the end of class. But I have those like CL assigned times. If it's easier, don't pay attention to those. It's just a way for me to like cover my end of things that I guaranteed you a spot. In practice, week to week, you can attend. I know I've said this before, but whichever day and time work for you. If it's easier, I put up under the files tab a summary of what those days and times are. I'll post an announcement after class that states this ever loads. But the CL sessions will start tonight, and they'll also be on Sunday, with the exception of one of the leaders can't make it. Well, I won't go into the details, but they can't make it tonight. So one of the locations tonight won't be available. I don't know why this is giving me the spinning wheel of death. So let's see if it goes quicker for me to download it. Let's see. Thought this would be relatively quick, but maybe not. All right, there we go. So that Excel file just kind of has the days and times and what locations are available. So you can attend any of these to get that additional extra credit from attending. Whichever one works for you, you can go a different one every single week. So this would be the kind of main file where you can identify what locations are available at what days and times. Okay. And that's, I don't know if we'll get here today, but that's underneath the files tab here, CL times summary. Okay. Other than that, any questions for me before we dive back into week 2 slides and jump back into kind of material here? You okay? Okay. All right. So we left off last class and we're thinking about individual production possibilities curves, right? So this is like 2 people, 2 countries. We analyze like their choice between producing 2 goods. We drew these curves. Now those curves, we said person 1 or country 1 can use all their resources to produce good A or good B. So our production possibilities curve was then just a straight line or linear curve between those 2 points. What we're going to talk about today is an economy-wide production possibilities curve. Okay. So this economy-wide production possibilities curve will start out thinking about kind of a goofy example. Well, it might seem goofy, but you can kind of take these models. I wanted to use this because we can think about really anything as like an economy. It doesn't have to be like an entire country. This could actually be like your own individual decisions. This could be a firm. This could be anything. So I had this idea to like put this into, all of you have professors and some of them are really good at research and some of them are really good at teaching. Maybe they're good, maybe not at both, right? Maybe they have absolute advantages, but maybe they have comparative advantages, right? So let's say we've got person or kind of your first professor here. We've got, they're writing papers only. They could produce 5. Second person writing only academic papers, produce 2. Number of students they could teach. And let's say the number of students they could teach well is 30 and 40. Okay. So as they devote more of their time towards writing these papers, they're not going to be able to teach as many students as well. Or they're not putting as much time into that. Okay. So here, what do we really want? Well, from last class, we would want to know, okay, who has a comparative advantage? And here, I think I'm going to put, what do I want to be on the axis here? I'll make it easier. We'll do papers here. So put quantity of papers on my x-axis, quantity of students taught well, on my y-axis, okay? So we can think about the production possibilities curve of each one of these individuals in my economy, right? So for the first person, if they're only writing papers, we've got what? 5, only teaching students well, they could teach 30. Their production possibilities curve was a line between those 2 points. Second person, 40 students, 2 papers. I'm trying to draw this to scale, kind of show a slightly steeper curve there. So how would I find the cost to writing one more paper? The cost of the x-axis good. Last class, we said that would be equal to my what? Slope, right? So how do I find the slope? The change in y over change in x. So negative 30 over 5. So what? Negative 6. And then over here, negative 40 over 2, or negative 20. Okay. So anytime I'm given the amount of each of these goods that each person can produce, or each country, or each firm, whatever the example is, I could then think about how can I identify who has a comparative advantage, right? So I could think about what is the cost of one more paper to these individuals, and then what would the cost of one more kind of student being taught well? Well, we just identified the cost of writing one more paper, the x-axis good. That was going to be what? Now, I wouldn't write negative 6 in here. We said inherently when we're talking about a cost, slope is always going to represent that there's a trade-off, right? So it's always going to be negative. So the cost to person 1, right, was for every paper they had to give up teaching 6 students well. For person 2, they were giving up teaching 20 students well. How do I find the cost of my y-axis good? The inverse, or 1 over the cost of that x-axis good. So I've got my cost now to both of these products. If we think about, let's say it's a very simple model. We have a university with 2 people in it, right? Two professors, right? What would be the economy-wide production possible? So this was each individual's production possibilities curve. We want to know, what does the economy-wide production possibilities curve look like? Okay. So here I'm going to put papers down here on my x-axis. I'm still going to have students. Well, I left a gap here for some reason. Students on my y-axis. So if I'm only having my faculty teach, and I don't care if they do any research at all, I want all their time devoted to teaching students well. How many students could they teach well here? Well, person 2 could teach 40, person 2, 30. So my entire economy, my 2-person economy, I would have a total of, what about papers? Yeah. Now, what I won't do with my economy-wide production possibilities curve is then draw a straight line between those 2 points. So let's think about why. So if I'm going from 0 to 1, I want that first academic paper written. I'm going to have some of my faculty members start to divert their resources towards teaching, towards writing these academic papers. Who am I going to want to rely on first? Whoever can write that paper at the lowest cost. Who has the lowest cost? Person 1. So initially, my production possibilities curve is going to have the slope of whatever person can produce that x-axis good at my lowest cost. So here, that slope would be negative 6, right? Or the cost of 6 students. Now, as I want to have more and more papers written, eventually I get to this point where if I want to go from 5 to 6, well, person 1, do they have enough resources to write 6 papers? No. So if I want to go from 5 to 6, I've now relied on person 1 to use all their resources to write academic papers. Who do I have to start relying on? The person who can do it at the next low. Well, I only have 2 people, so I have to rely on the next person. What is their cost? Much higher, right? So in my economy-wide production possibilities curve, the slope of my curve is actually going to change as I produce more of that x-axis good. I'm going to try not to fall, right? And this shows up with a very simple 2-person model here, okay? Any questions on this before we keep moving? Okay. So I'll show you a couple other things we can do here, and then I'll expand to what's a more realistic economy-wide. It doesn't just have two people. So let's say I'm interested in different points along my production possibilities curve here. And I only ever do this if I ask you questions like this. I'll keep it simple at two-person model. So if you look at the practice problems, you should see this. So let's say I wanted to be at, well, I didn't draw a scale, but it's okay. At 3 academic papers here. So I want to go from 0 to 3. Who am I going to rely on? Excuse me. Who am I going to rely on to do that first? The person who's going to do it at the lowest cost. Each paper is costing them 6 students so they can teach well. So what's the total cost? 18, right? If I want to go from 0 to 3, I'd have to give up 6 for every single one. 3 times 6. I'm giving up 18. So this point would be, well, here, I ran out of room here, but this would be what? 52? Not, yeah. So 352 would be a point that's on my production possibilities curve. And I would kind of use that similar thought process to find, where would I be at 4 and 5, et cetera. So the extreme points are easy. That's just take how much each person could produce. If I'm only producing that good, what are my X and Y intercept? The middle point's easy. This is where both individuals are only producing what they have a comparative advantage at. Notice if I'm at 5, well, that's using all of person one's resources. What does the Y value have to be here? Well, person one is no longer teaching students, so I'm at what? 40? Because I've only got the other person producing what they're good at. So that middle point is going to be the combination of the two goods where each individual is only producing what they have a comparative advantage in. Now, if I want to move past that point, so let's say I want to go from 5 to 6 papers, right? So I'm at 40 here. How much, to go from that 5th to the 6th, how many students am I going to have to give up? Well, I'm now going to have to rely on the next person, because person one's already using all their resources to write all 5 of these papers. So to get one more paper, I have to rely on person 2. Their cost was 20 students. So I'd be going from 40 all the way to 20. Right? So I can find any point along this curve. I just have to remember that at this top part, I'm dealing with person one's costs, right? Whoever can do it at the lowest. Eventually, I'm going to hit a point where to get more of that x-axis good, I have to start relying on whoever can do it at the next lowest cost, or in these simple two-person models, person 2 or country 2 or firm 2. Is this any questions on this idea here? Are we good with this? Okay. So what does this look like a little bit more practical in person, right? Or practical in person, in the real world, right? So it doesn't matter what two goods we're looking at, right? I'm going to have, if I'm using all of my resources to produce Y, I can get this much. All of my resources to produce X, I could get this much. Okay. Who am I going to rely on to first start producing this good? So I think I've got an example in the slides. I think it's something about like writing academic papers. I changed it a little bit. And like writing songs, like music. So in our economy, like we want people to produce things that like advance society, but we also want like aesthetics, right? We want to be able to listen to good music, like sculptures, good art, things like that. So who do we want to rely on first to start producing, say, songs? Not me, right? It would come at a very high cost. I could produce maybe one song if I worked on it for the next 10 years, and it would still probably be shit. So who do I rely on? Someone who has a lot of skill at writing songs, and they're not having to give up much of something else. Or essentially, who am I relying on first to produce something? Whoever has the lowest. So what's going to be true? If I could have, like, theoretically, 0 cost, we know that there has to be some trade-off, but the lowest cost, if it was 0, what would be the slope of my production possibilities curve? Flat, right? So it's going to be very close to flat. After that first person uses all their resources, if I want more of this x-axis good, who do I have to start relying on? Next lowest cost, the next lowest, the next lowest, the next. And what we get is this nice, I'm looking at my entire economy where I've got millions of people, my economy-wide production possibilities curve will have this kind of nice, kind of bowed out slope to it. Why? Because that's reflecting that initially, what's true about my slope when I'm producing a small amount of that X good, if I want to keep producing more and more of it, my slope is becoming steeper, which also means that my costs are doing what? Going up. Right? Okay. Any questions here? I'm also going to stay here and we'll go to the slides. The slides probably have summaries of a lot of what I'm going to say, but I think it makes sense for me to stay on here and draw some of this out for you right now. Okay. So if you want to draw this on the same graph, you can. I'm just going to draw another one really quick, just to kind of not muddy it up here too much. So good X, good Y. And now let's say we've got this nice production possibilities curve. Okay? Every point on this curve, similar to when I was looking at a two-person model, I didn't say this, but when I was going from like 3 to 5 or 5 to 6, inherently, what was I assuming the entire time? That when I was giving up something, I was using all of those resources to produce the other thing, right? So in this, when we're building this production possibilities curve, even with a very simple two-person model, the points on the curve are, we're assuming that we're using every person's resource, all of them, right? So every point on this curve is going to be, and I think even in the slides, I got a little bit lazy. I should have, later on I didn't, but to introduce it, I say it's just efficient. In fact, we would put another kind of, we phrase it a little bit different. We say it's not just efficient, it's production efficient, right? So any point on this curve, we're using all of our resources, okay? Now, sometimes it's easier to think about like the extreme points. Let's say if I'm using all of my resources in my economy, I could get 500 of good X. If I were at a point underneath the curve, let's say, I don't know, 300, what does that mean? What am I not doing? Not maximizing how much I can produce, or inherently, I'm not using all of my resources. So any point, not just on the axis here, but any point here, I could always move to getting more of both of these goods, right? Because I'm not using all of my resources. So anything underneath the curve, we would say we're being inefficient. And once again, probably technically a little bit more correct, we're being production inefficient. We're not using all of our resources, okay? Now, why don't I produce out at points like this? Well, what did this point represent? If I used everyone's resources, I could get 500. So why can't I get out to here? I don't have enough resources, right? So every point above this curve, we would say is unattainable, right? We don't have enough resources to get out that far. Okay. Any questions here before we keep moving? Is this making sense? Hopefully looks, maybe remembering some things we saw maybe on the reading. Excuse me. So this is probably a good example where sometimes in class, I will rifle through slides because I find it more valuable to maybe spend some time up here. And you always can go back in the slides, but this just kind of summarizes what we were talking about. So one thing that I didn't, we talked about these inefficient, unattainable points. Another thing I wanted to make a point of that I said, but I didn't quite go far enough. We said when we produce more of that x-axis good, what was happening to my slope? It was kind of increasing in absolute value. Well, if my slope is larger, it represents my cost, but it's the cost of one more of that x-axis good. So it's not just representing cost, it's actually representing What word do we use for additional? Marginal costs. So as I produce more of that X good, my marginal costs are increasing. Now, one thing that this also inherently means, how do I find this cost of my Y-axis good? It was the inverse, or 1 over the slope, or 1 over the cost of my X-axis good. So as I produce more of X, that means the marginal cost of X is going up. What's happening to the marginal cost of the last unit of Y I produced? It must be going down, right? Because if 1 over the cost of the X-axis, if the cost of the X-axis good is getting higher, I have a larger denominator, and the cost of my Y-axis good has to be going down. So producing more of one of these goods, yes, it'll change the cost of that good, but inherently, it's also going to be changing. Oh, where did I have it? Here it is. It not only changes the marginal cost of my X-axis good, because the cost of my Y-axis good is 1 over the cost of that X-axis good, or 1 over the slope, that means that the cost of my Y-axis good has to be getting smaller. Okay. Any questions on that idea? Yeah. Yeah, I'd have to, right? If I ask you a question, like on the quiz or the exam or something like that, I have to specify what good is on the X or Y, because if I don't, you don't know, right? So yeah, I will always kind of specify. Yep. Any other questions before we keep moving? This kind of summarizes a little bit more, like just in bullet word form, what we were doing up here. I don't know. I always think having visuals usually makes things a little bit easier. So this is, I think I left this slide open. Yeah, for these production possibilities curve zones, we already talked about these. So here, what point would be unattainable? A, right? It's past my production possibilities curve. What point would be inefficient? What would B and C be? Efficient, and let's be careful, because the next thing I'm going to introduce, they're not just efficient. I said they are production efficient. They inherently move that, or mean that we're using all of our resources. Now, when I'm choosing, do I want to be? I know that I'm using all my resources. I can produce at point C, or I can produce at point B. Which one do I want to choose? I don't know, right? We need to do a little bit more analysis, right? We know that as I produce at different points on this curve, what's happening to the marginal cost of this X-axis good? It's changing, right? So what's also going to be changing, right, is that when I have more of something, we said last class, I used cars as an example. When I go from 0 to 1 cars, my marginal benefit is very high. When I go from 1 to 2, it is lower. So as you buy more of something, even think about, I go to Chick-fil-A for lunch and I get a spicy chicken sandwich. The first one, huge marginal benefit. Second one, I probably was not quite full, but it didn't, satisfy me as much as the first. I get to the third, it might be negative, right? I'm so full, I can't do anything the rest of the afternoon. So you start to think about, as you have more of something, that marginal benefit is declining, right? Same kind of thing exists for an economy, right? Think about this in terms of, sometimes I walk around campus and I see things and I think those are pretty, right? Or that's a cool feature of campus, like well, in the morning, sometimes it scares the shit. I mean, I walk and I see like those bronze, like there'll be a dude sitting on a bench and then it's, just a statue. And I know that's kind of a cool feature when we walk around campus, but if the university devoted all of their resources towards putting up these statues all around, is that going to be efficient for society? No, right? They need to be putting it into buildings. In fact, there's some buildings you could argue they should be putting more money into right now, right? And so we do want some of these things, but as we invest more and more, then that marginal benefit is declining, right? So we've got this diminishing marginal benefit. We actually already said, so scoot over here. If I'm thinking about any good, or the decision between, like I said, the university makes decisions about putting money towards aesthetic things versus technology, all these, whatever your X and Y good is. We inherently know that as I have more and more of this X good, we said our marginal benefit is going to be declining. Okay. As I produce more and more of this x-axis good, what do we say is true about the marginal cost? Well, that's the slope of our production possibilities curve. So as I produce more and more of X, my marginal cost is increasing. So some of the things we talked about last class, I like to use this term. I don't think the book uses it as much. This is where sometimes I like deviate a little bit from the book. But the net benefit, we said last week, people, which inherently make up an economy, are self-interested and rational. They'll choose to do something if the net benefit is positive, right? If you're going to be better off, you should choose to do that, right? Well, what it makes you better off if the net benefit is positive, or we said as long as that marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. And in fact, we actually added in, we'll actually go to the point where also they're equal because we know we're no better or worse off there. Like we'll go up to that. So if I'm an economy and I have all these different points I can choose from, right? All of them are production efficient. I'll be using all of my resources. Nothing's laying around, going to waste. Am I going to want to produce produce the amount of X that puts me at this point? Well, that unit or that amount of good X, the marginal benefit is much greater than marginal cost. So my society was benefiting from having that amount of X. But why would I stop there? Because if I produce a little bit more of good X and I start to move down my production possibilities curve, what's true about the next few units? The marginal benefit is still above the marginal. I'm becoming better and better off. The net benefits are still positive. In fact, I'll keep producing more of good X until I get to what point? Where those marginal benefits are exactly equal to, right? Now in practice, like I said, like right up to that point, we use the equality so that we can actually have a point we identify. But we know that at this point, they're indifferent. So this would be what we call the allocative efficient point. So it's not production efficient, but it's allocative efficient. Now, every allocative efficient point is going to be on my production possibilities curve. So every allocative efficient point should be production efficient. But every production efficient point isn't going to be allocatively efficient. There's only one allocatively efficient point for society or our economy. Okay. Right? Hopefully, you can see, you can map out these quantities. It's just good X, so you could just figure out where you would be at. Well, I guess here I chose over here, right? That would be the allocative efficient quantity. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep? Okay with this? Okay, I think it starts to get a little bit trickier here, but we don't have any questions. Good. All right. Actually, let me make sure. Is there anything else I want to say? I'll use the slides. I put time into them. I should use them instead of drawing everything out. But I don't know. Tell me with just a nod of heads. I might throw this into a thing on. Does it help you to see these like bill out, even though like I have them complete in the slides? Yes, no, yeah, okay. So I'll try to do more up here than I even plan to. But you always have the slides for reference, right? So we talked about identifying that allocated efficient point. Let's think about things that are going to cause. Now, I'll try to be a little bit when it comes to the quizzes or when it comes to the exam. Anytime I say just an outward shift, assume that means like a parallel outward shift. So if the entire curve is shifting outward. So here, what's going to cause an outward shift in our production possibilities curve? Well, if we think about an economy as a whole, if I'm only producing good X, what's one thing, if I'm adding up how much each person can produce to get this point, what's one thing that'll make it go up if I have more people, right? So population growth should increase not only this point, but every single point. right? I have more resources available. I have more labor hours available to me if my population grows. Right? So once again, I'm not making this a political thing, but we're just thinking about things we can put into practice in the real world. If we know that the US has a birth rate below 2, which means we're not replacing ourselves, right? What's happening to our labor hours? Now, right? So what's maybe something I can do to increase my labor hours? Come on in, people around the world, right? Like I can increase my population by allowing more people into my country. So we might, population growth doesn't necessarily have to be like natural born citizens, right? This is the number of people we have working in our economy. Okay. Technology changes. Anytime I have, this is what the Packback assignment we kind of related to. So things like ChatGPT might make workers more productive, right? Doesn't matter what they're producing, right? Now, ChatGPT is not a perfect example of that. Probably a technology change that would impact everything evenly is like, I don't know, the invention of like literally a personal computer, right? Or the invention of an iPhone, right? A phone that, I guess not an iPhone specifically, but like a phone that you can access the internet on, right? So there's technology changes that will impact the production of all goods. And then we also have things like capital productivity. So why are all of you here? You think that once you leave, you're going to be able to, are you here just, parents dying, having fun? What do you expect to happen once you get out of here with your degree? You will make more money than if you did. All right. That's a lot of the idea. Why can you make more money? Because hopefully, if you've done things correctly, once you're done here, you will have more skills, right? You will be more productive to a firm. They are willing to pay you more if you're more productive. So human capital is another thing that we see shift out this production possible. Once you have more knowledge, it doesn't matter what firm hires you, especially like if you're working at a general, I guess, if I'm like a biology major, I guess it matters. But if I'm like a business major, whatever firm hires me to run their marketing department, I'm going to be productive at all of them, right? So here we can kind of think about these changes in even human capital. We might see these nice parallel shifts outward in our production possibilities curve. Why do we like this as an economy? Well, what was true about this point before the technology change? It was unattainable. What's true about it now? Not only is it attainable, it's inefficient, right? I can get even further out than that point, right? So combinations of these two goods that weren't possible in my economy before, with these technology improvements or population growth or productivity or human capital, things like that, now make them attainable. Okay. Now, well, I won't dive into that yet. Any questions on this idea before we keep moving? So this one's not too bad. What did I do? iPhones and wheat here. So I'll build this one out for us. So let's say I have two products, right? And here's my production possibilities curve initially. It's kind of weird to think about, but we could do marginal cost, marginal benefits. So let's say before, here's my marginal benefits to producing wheat. Here's my marginal costs, right? So if I was measuring the slope, I could plot out those marginal costs. And for now, we haven't really dove into where these marginal benefits come from. Let's just assume we had information on it, right? So where would my allocative efficient point be? Right here, right? I could kind of map that out to the same quantity of wheat to say, okay, here's my allocative efficient point, okay? I haven't quite done that yet, but that's kind of connecting the two. I can get my marginal cost for my production possibilities curve. I can then kind of map those out and put those on a different graph where I look at where's the allocative efficient point then. Okay. Any questions on this? So what if I have a technology change that only impacts iPhones? Well, then that means, let's say population hasn't changed, nothing else has changed. I read this, I'm going to butcher this, but something not too long ago, I read something about like, not just iPhones, but any phone, the battery, is it lithium they primarily use? There was some technology advancement where like they could make it use like, I forget what factor less lithium and still get the same level of output. So there's always, just assume some new technology advancement where they don't have to use as much of this raw material. So now the same amount of lithium I can maybe get, instead of 20, I can get 40 iPhones, right? So what's going to happen? If I'm only producing iPhones, I can now get more, right? Because of this technology change. Well, did that new discovery about how to use lithium more efficiently impact the amount of wheat production? To my knowledge, I don't think there's combines running off lithium power. There may be. I could be very wrong about this, but I don't think that discovery probably impacted the wheat market very much. And so if we have technology changes that only impact one good, well, notice then the intercept really only is going to change on one, or our intercept will only change on one of the axes, right? And it won't change on the other. Now, there's a mathematical proof for this. You really are interested, maybe we can talk after class or office hours, but I guess trust me, and I try to, when you draw it, you can kind of prove it to yourself visually. What is happening, right? If I'm thinking about, well, I can use the extreme to really highlight it. What's happening to my slope when this kind of shift on one of the axes, this y-axis occurs? It looks like, and kind of draw it here too, at the same like level, it looks like my slope is becoming steeper, right? So what does that mean? If I have a technology change, what's happening to the marginal cost of wheat here? That marginal cost is going up, right? So if I have a technology change that impacts my y-axis good, we'll think about it this way. To get the same amount of wheat now, I was giving up a certain amount of resources before. It might have cost me 20 iPhones. Well, but now because I can produce iPhones so much more effectively, using the same amount of resources to put towards wheat, I don't have to give up 20 iPhones. I'm not giving up 100 iPhones. So inherently, when we have technology changes that impact a good, the marginal cost of the other good will always go up. Right? Which means if the marginal cost of wheat is going up, what's happening to the marginal cost of iPhones? Should be going down, right? But we're interested in the market for wheat because we can see here, when there's technology changes in other goods, what happens to my product? It becomes more costly for society to produce. So what's going to be true? At every quantity, where's the marginal cost? It's not here anymore. It's going to be higher. At this quantity, the marginal cost is what it was before, higher. Is what it was before, higher. So because, we'll kind of call this 2, right? Because my marginal cost of wheat were increasing, what happened to the allocative efficient point? It actually fell, right? So anytime we have technology changes, that's inherently going to impact, if it only impacts one good, it's going to change the marginal cost. It's going to change that relationship, that trade-off relationship that exists between the two goods. By changing the marginal cost, even if the benefits stay the same, it's going to change what point is allocatively efficient for my society. So what do we see countries like the US as we, have these technology changes or advancements for certain goods, certain products, rockets, high-level computing devices? What do we stop producing? Textiles, right? Clothing. We import like all of it, right? So we see that the allocated efficient point for different products will start to change based off of technology improvements that I see in my society, right? Now, the allocated efficient point might change for me. What's one thing we talked about last class? Every country or economy faces this. So even if I experience the technology change and other countries don't, what can hopefully help me get back, even though I'm not producing as much wheat, if I want the same level of wheat as before, I can trade, right? So even though it's changing this allocated efficient point, if we have allowed for trade, we might still be able to get the same amount of wheat we had before, but even more of the other product technology product here at the line. Questions on this idea before I'm going to stop in 15 minutes. Okay. All right. So we kind of talked through this already, right? A technology change that only impacts one of the goods, right? Our marginal costs are going up. We're then going to model, oops. We can take these models and apply them to like sets of goods or different decision making. So one of the things we can think about is the investment between consumption and capital goods. So we're interested in things like economic growth, right? I might, and I'm going to go to the doc here in a second. But if consumption goods are things like clothing, food, right? You consume it. Once you use it, it's kind of gone. Those resources are gone. Capital goods are things like if I'm investing in education, well, that has future payouts, right? If I'm investing into the infrastructure of my economy, that has future payouts, right? So I have this trade-off between consumption and capital. And in fact, investment in these capital products, right, I know will also inherently increase how much my economy can produce, right? Even if, so what's the quantity of anything my economy can produce? It's going to be some combination of what natural resources do I have available to me, right? Raw materials, steel, plastic, whatever it is, right? Land, that's important. We don't think about it as much, but like I need a physical space to operate a business or to create things. We probably focus a little bit more on labor and capital, right? Because those are the real variable things, right? I can hire more workers. My economy can have more people. I can invest more in these capital products. I can have better machinery, better technology. And then we also can have human capital. I can improve, it works, capital and human capital the same way. If I give my workers better machinery, they can produce more. If I give my workers more knowledge, they can also likely find a way to use the same machinery to produce more, right? And then A is going to represent, if we have varied levels of technology, the same inputs could get me a higher level of output. I could have the same workers, same capital, but if I've just got better technology, that same amount would produce a higher level of output. Okay. So we're going to use this and thinking about kind of the per worker production function, or how much output we're getting per worker, and the amount of investment that we're making per worker, right? So we're kind of keeping the number of workers constant and thinking about, as I invest more into capital, what's happening to the overall level of production in my economy, right? So what is this going to look like? Right? I'm going to try to tie this all together. It's going to get kind of tough. So here I've got let's say I have this choice between two products. I mentioned them already. Consumption goods or capital goods, right? Capital goods are investments in things that I know will kind of increase output in the future. Consumption like makes my people happy, right? Food, clothing, things like that. The same trade-off exists between these two types of goods, right? So we don't just have to do like iPhones and wheat. We can do like sets of goods, right? I won't push you guys quite that far, like in terms of like how do we determine what's in these sets, but here I want to show you we can extend these models. So as I invest more into capital, what's happening to the cost of investing into capital goods? I'm giving up. So if the slope is increasing to produce or to have more and more capital goods, I'm going to have to give up more and more consumption goods, right? Initially, my initial investments, right? I was giving up the things in my economy that didn't matter. Fidget spinners, stupid products that are like fads, right? Now, eventually, if I want to take all my resources, what's the cost? Well, my people aren't eating. It's a pretty high cost, right? If I don't have any, so we know that as we invest more into capital goods, the cost is increasing. So I could map these out if I really was thinking about, okay, what is my optimal level of investment into capital goods? Well, the slope here represents my marginal costs. We said the marginal costs are increasing, right? I could do that, right? So what's the other thing that we would need in order to determine the allocative efficient quantity of investment into capital goods? I've got marginal costs. I also need marginal benefits. Okay. So I'll come back here, but I've got a slide. All right. So let's say I had something like this where I've kind of canceled out like the number of workers. So that's why it's like per worker. We're like keeping the number of workers constant. If I invested more into capital, right, I'm increasing that quantity of capital products I'm investing in. The first $100, right, if I'm thinking about investing into projects that will maybe produce new technology, which projects am I going to invest in first? The ones that I think will have the greatest impact, right? I want to invest in products or into projects, even thinking about like at a company level. I want to invest in the projects that I think are going to have the highest profitability. So I take the first $100 and I put it into what I think is the most valuable. Then the next $100 I have laying around, well, I then try to identify what's the next most profitable project. Well, when we're thinking about if we're trying to increase our output, right, as an economy, I take that first $100 and I invest it into the projects that I think are going to have the highest additional output. So that first $100 I invest, how many units am I getting out of it? Here I've got it kind of plotted, looks like about 500 additional units. So I guess what the marginal benefit would be, spend $100, you got 500, so 5. Now, if I want to continue to invest in the capital, the next $100 I invest increases it to 900. So what's my marginal output there? What was the marginal benefit? I got an additional 400 units from $100 investment. My marginal output or benefit here would be 4 units per dollar I invested. And then you kind of continue, to do this, so on and so forth. What's happening if I'm investing in less and less productive projects or profitable projects? That marginal benefit should be decreasing. Okay? So when we're investing in the capital, it's just like when we talked about consuming goods. If I was buying more of something, same principle applies. That marginal benefit is going to be declining, right? So we could kind of use that per worker production function, which I use the slides for, and really come up with a dollar value to that additional output that we were getting. And we could then come up with an allocatively efficient point per society, right? What combination of consumption and capital goods would be allocatively efficient for our society, right? And it's the same principles that we were using earlier, right? It's the fact that this trade-off between the production of 2 goods, or here how much of the consumption or capital goods I'm producing. That trade-off creates some additional costs, marginal costs. I know there's additional marginal benefits to having more of that thing. And that's just a matter of, we go up to the point where the marginal benefit is greater than or equal to, right? Up to that point where it's equal to the marginal cost. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving here? I get worried when I don't get as many questions. Okay. So there's a slide that's blank where we talk about this. I'm going to add in something else as well. So this was like the dollars I invested in capital per worker and the output I was getting per worker. So I think the book calls this like the per worker production function. And I think if they give you like a more accurate, I think it actually I'll hold up on that because that's something we'll talk about in a later chapter. We've got this kind of decreasing marginal benefit, right? That the additional output I was getting as I invested the same amount in the capital, the additional output I'm getting is going down, right? If I have a new technology change, what should happen if I invest the same amount into my workers, but I have this new technology change? So like if you go back like 70 years, if I sent my workers all to college and they come back, they don't have computers, so they were more effective. But now if I send all my workers to college, they now have like an idea about how to use like these data management programs. Well, now that same investment into my workers, they're way more effective. They can produce way more of whatever so at every level, a technology change will actually increase this per worker production function. Once again, we could go through the mathematics, but if it's kind of a multiplier here, what's going to happen to my slope at every point? My slope is now becoming steeper. So what did the slope represent here? This was the additional output. We said there's a way that we could somehow convert that to dollars. This kind of represents that my marginal benefits at every point are now higher. So if I can get a technology improvement, the marginal benefit of every amount of investment into capital is now higher. So what has happened to the allocative efficient point? I'll kind of call this T, like after the technology change. When we have these technology changes, the same amount of investment into capital is more beneficial to my economy. So if the costs haven't changed, I should end up with the allocatively efficient point is that once I have this new technology, I invest even more into capital goods, right? Companies before computers existed, they had some incentive to invest in their workers to send them back to college. Now companies have a much larger incentive. So we see more companies actually paying for their workers to return to education as opposed to 70 years ago, right? Okay. Questions on this before we continue? All right. I get this is getting tough. So I think we'll kind of end it here. If we have time for growth rates, I'll come back to them. But what I want to do at this point, so we go to 1050, right? Yes. Sorry, I'm still getting used to like the new class times. The other ones like ended on nice numbers, and these ones are a little bit different. So let's go to Canvas. Let's make sure I have this set to be released. Past 1025, so we're good. So this is in general a little bit more of like what these class participation will look like. So the last one, I was still not sure if we could use top hat or not, so I had to pivot. So generally what I'll do is I'll set up this first question. Every class period is going to be worth a total of 2 points. Half for just kind of being here responding, half for getting the answers correct. Okay? So sometimes there'll be more than 2 questions. I'll just divide up the additional point into how many questions are. Here we've got 2 questions. So just for getting open this quiz and getting it submitted, and don't submit it, and this will be something I would probably not do moving forward as well. I might talk through one of these questions with you at the end after I give you some time to work on it. So I would hold off on submitting it, right, until I tell you to. But when you do submit it, all you have to do to earn half the credit for this is just simply click on this participation point box. I'm trying to make it easy for you. I don't give you any other options, right? All you have to do is click on this to earn that 1 out of the 2 points for the day. The other 2 questions are worth half a point for getting them correct. So the first one, we've got basically a 2 good model, nuclear and coal power, right? So if I have a technology advancement that impacts nuclear power, but not coal power, right? If I put nuclear power on the x-axis, what's going to happen to my production possibilities curve? So when I say shift outward or shift inward here, that's going to be a parallel shift, right? If I say it becomes flatter or steeper, that means that at any point on that production possibilities curve, the production possibilities curve is now flatter or steeper than it was before, okay? So I'll give you a little bit of time to kind of work on this. The third one, right? And this is, I'm pushing you a little bit further on this. If you had a technology improvement, right? Investing the same amount of capital per worker. So we've got this technology improvement that's an impact the amount of capital we're investing per worker. Okay. Would you, if you invested the exact same amount, is it going to increase or decrease the amount of output you get from that same level of investment? So after a technology improvement, you continue to invest the same amount in the capital. is that going to increase the marginal benefit that you have, right? Or the additional output you get per worker? And then in combination with this, right? If you have this additional technology improvement in one of these products, right? Here thinking about, if I'm thinking about the goods that experience this technology improvement, should it make the country or firm more or less likely to have a comparative advantage? So we'll kind of walk through these together here in a little bit, or at least one of them. I'd focus a little bit more on two. We might not cover that one together, at least before I tell you to submit it. Question three, I might help you out a little bit with. So I think I've got this set to be due at 10:40. So another 10 minutes. Kind of work on these, talk to the people around you. And like I said, after 6 or 7 minutes here, I might take a little bit of time to kind of walk through question three with you a little bit. Okay. This now. All right. So. Read mouse in bed. At least talking about single right thing. Right. So I'll be probably pretty kind today. This is where showing up to class, these should be easy points, right? And should be able to get them correct more often than not. Sometimes I may not be as nice and walk through them with you. I might just kind of leave it open and then say, you know, open, to the end of whenever I had it set to, and then we might review them after the quiz has to be submitted. But we still have 5 minutes, so I think we can kind of get through the correct answers here, right? So I'll do the tough one first, all right? So let's start with question 3, right? So I've got this technology change, and I want to know if I'm investing the same amount of capital per worker, what happens to the additional output I'm getting per worker, right? So we said this per worker production function, it's going to look something like this, right? So if I had the same investment in the capital, if I have a technology change, what was happening to that production function? Well, in the same amount of investment, I should be able to get more or less. More, right? I now have the same investment, but my workers have more technology available to them. So we had this increase in that per worker production function. So the amount of output I'm getting from the same level of investment has done what? Increased. Okay. Now, this is why I'm also walking through, because I kind of threw this together, and I don't like the way I phrased the question. Because when I asked about what are they more likely to have a comparative advantage in, what I was thinking of here is whatever good had the technology change, are they more likely to have a comparative advantage in that good, right? So we can think about how it impacts the per worker production function, right? My investment in the capital. But now if I'm thinking about here, I've got a good, and this could be any good, but the one that experienced the technology change. So I think before I drew out one where the y-axis good had the technology change. So I just wanted to make sure you can see, you can do it either way. You can have both, right? So here's my original production possibilities curve. What happens if I have a technology change that only impacts, certain goods? We'll call it this good X is the one that was impacted. What's going to happen to this point? Well, good Y wasn't impacted. It's not going to change at all, right? However, the good that experienced the technology change, I know that if I'm using all of my resources, I can get more of it, right? So what's happened, no matter what point I look at, right? So I could use any point here. I'm just going to use this one specifically. If I look at the slope, and I try to kind of draw this to scale here, but you can kind of see what's happening at every point after this technology change to my slope for that x-axis good. Well, the slope is becoming flatter, right? Or a smaller number, which means the cost of that x-axis good at every point is now lower, right? So if my production possibilities curve becomes flatter, that x-axis good, the marginal cost is going down at every point. If my marginal cost of producing this good is lower at every point, is it more or less likely I have a comparative advantage? When do you have a comparative advantage? When you have the lowest cost, right? So if my costs are lower, it would be more likely I have a comparative advantage, right? So if I have a country and I have certain products that experience these technology changes, it becomes more likely that I'm going to have this technology change, okay? So just before, make sure time-wise that we get this submitted. So that was what? An increase, right? And then more, right? Should have been the correct answer there, okay? And now for this one, if I had a technology change that only impacts one of these products, it's really the same thing that we just drew, right? Because it's only impacting nuclear power, it's going to, and nuclear power is on the x-axis, it's going to kick out, right? My production possibilities curve on the x-axis, So it won't be a parallel outward shift. It's going to make my entire production possibilities curve a little bit, and do it with your arm if it helps, right? That's why I do it, right? I think about, oh yeah, becoming flatter. This end kicks out flatter. If this end kicks up, it's becoming steeper. Okay? So make sure you kind of get this submitted. I think I had it set to be 10:40. If for whatever reason it treats it late, I'm going to go back in after the fact and I'll just extend it a couple minutes so that I make sure I can get everybody who's here today, as long as we respond, by 10:41, 10:42 here. Okay, so get that quiz submitted. Any questions over either of those before we keep moving? So before you get excited, pack up and leave, I got a couple things that I want to go through. So the first thing is going to be, if you go to Packback, the very first assignment, and I'll actually even set it, I think I have it set to release here. So it should be available to us. Let's see, yeah. You'll now see that there's an open assignment, right? So Packback number 1, I have it set to be due not next Friday, but the Friday after that. So you got 2 weeks to kind of get on and get this done, especially this first one. I want to make sure we get registered okay. You haven't registered yet, right? Make sure you get on and do that. If it asks you for a community lookup code, that is a code that is in the first week's slides, right? On the Packback slide, okay? So I've put up a couple links, this initial guidepost. I've got a couple articles. This MIT article is very academic. By no means am I expecting you to like read through that. If you wanted to read the summary on it, but those other 2 articles are a little bit more like, CNN type, something you would see out there. So kind of read through those. Sorry, that didn't help. We'll go to Packback. You should now see that first assignment up there. And you can access this through Canvas as well. I like to do it on a separate browser just because sometimes it can be a little bit clunky operating it off of Canvas. But you've got this initial guidepost, the 2 articles. That article I said, don't worry about going through it with a fine-tooth comb. But it's all related to like the increase in productivity economies can expect with the growth of ChatGPT and AI, right? A lot of what we talked about kind of applies to that because we've been talking about productivity, whether that's a per worker output function, whether or not that's technology changes in certain types of goods, right? So I posed some questions. I summarize these articles a little bit, trying to get you thinking about certain questions or statements you could have about this topic. So you're supposed to use this guidepost, and you'll hit this big red button, which is ask a question. So your initial response is this question, right? So I mentioned last week when we're doing these, to try to keep them, you can write like your thoughts and you can make statements, but try to like end every paragraph or end everything with more questions, right? So that you can kind of open it to other people to be able to respond to, right? Or post some questions that you might have. I might think ChatGPT might increase. We can expect that it's going to increase worker productivity. However, does that come at a cost of creativity? I can think about like the quantity of creative goods. And is that actually allocatively efficient for society? Right? I ended it with a question there. So, and obviously going to have to be a little bit longer than that. But that, I'm trying to give you an example of like I can make a statement and also include a question on the end of it. So that'll be your initial question or post. You will then respond to, once other people start doing that, you respond to 2 other people's questions or posts, and that'll be kind of how you earn full points in the assignment. So it's supposed to generate thought of how we take what we've talked about in class and apply it to some like real world topics, but then also building the skill of being able to discuss things in a back and forth manner. So like in the business school specifically, so I was in a business school before this, even though the econ department here is technically, we're technically over in the arts and sciences. You have to have interpersonal skills to get far or to be successful in the business world, right? Part of that is not being a know-it-all, right? And not shutting down everyone else's ideas. So this ability to go back and forth with people, to point out pros and cons, to point out, to mention different, benefits or costs of these different decisions, that is how you will operate in a successful business, right? It's not, this is the one way that's going to work and this is what we should do. That's not how the real world, that's not how any company operates, right? So it'll kind of help build that skill a little bit for you. The other thing that I had for today, and I've got it here, we kind of ran out of time. There is a question on the quiz about it, so I might change the quiz before I kind of get it posted. It was about growth rates. So we didn't quite have time to do that. I'll hold off on that. I might start with it on next week. Kind of show the power of interest rates and growth, but should be everything that we need to get through today. You'll see that quiz pop up shortly. Like I said, I might get back to my office and edit the very last question because we didn't quite have time to cover it. So that very last question you might see, I might leave it in there and it might say, this is the answer or something like that, right? So you might get a freebie this week. Other than that, a fun, safe weekend. I put up an announcement on Canvas. I'll be in my office 10 to noon tomorrow for additional office hours if you want to stop by or meet on Zoom. Other than that, fun, safe weekend, and I will see you guys on Tuesday.